There's a question that quietly follows almost everyone who has ever loved a narcissistic person. It often appears in the stillness of the night, when distractions disappear and the mind begins replaying old conversations, painful memories, and unanswered questions. Long after the relationship ends, long after the messages stop and the silence becomes permanent, one thought can remain louder than everything else. Do they feel anything after what they did to me? It is a question that often arrives when the world becomes quiet. During the day, you may keep yourself busy, focus on responsibilities, talk to other people, and convince yourself that you have moved forward. But when the noise disappears, the mind returns to the moments that never received an answer. You remember the promises, the affection, the confusion, and the pain. And somewhere beneath all those memories is the same question: how can someone hurt me so deeply and continue living as if nothing happened? The hardest part about being hurt by someone with narcissistic traits is not only the pain they caused, it is the confusion they leave behind. You are not just grieving the relationship, you are grieving the version of that person you believed existed. You are trying to understand how someone who once said they cared could also dismiss your feelings, ignore your suffering, or act as if your pain was an inconvenience. The human heart naturally searches for fairness. When someone breaks something precious, we expect them to notice the damage. We expect them to look at the pieces and feel something. We expect a moment of realization where they finally understand the impact of their actions. But narcissistic patterns can make this process complicated. Some individuals may feel emotions after hurting someone, but those emotions may not always appear as empathy or accountability. They may experience discomfort, frustration, loneliness, or even regret, but their focus can remain centered around their own feelings rather than the pain they created. They may think about losing access to someone who loved them. They may miss the attention, care, support, or validation they received. They may feel the emptiness left behind after someone walks away. But feeling the absence of a person is not always the same as understanding the wounds you caused that person. This distinction is painful but important. Someone can miss you and still not understand you. Someone can regret losing you and still not take responsibility. Someone can feel uncomfortable with the consequences of their actions while avoiding the deeper truth that their behavior caused harm. This is why many people who leave narcissistic relationships feel trapped in a cycle of questions. They wonder, do they ever think about me? Do they remember what they did? Do they feel guilty? Was any of it real? These questions are attempts to find emotional closure. The mind wants a final piece of evidence that proves the relationship mattered. It wants confirmation that the love you gave was seen, even if it was not respected. But sometimes the answer you are looking for cannot come from the person who created the confusion. A person who lacks emotional accountability may avoid looking deeply at their own behavior because doing so would challenge the image they have created of themselves. Accepting responsibility requires humility. It requires sitting with uncomfortable emotions and admitting, I hurt someone. For someone who depends heavily on protecting their ego, that moment of honesty can feel extremely threatening. Instead, they may rewrite the story. They may convince themselves that you were too sensitive, that you misunderstood them, or that they were justified. This does not mean your experience was false. It means their ability to face reality may be limited by their own emotional defenses, and this is where healing begins to shift. The question slowly changes from, do they feel anything after hurting me? To why am I allowing their feelings to determine my healing? Because your pain was real, even if they deny it. Your love was real, even if they failed to appreciate it. Your experience does not become less valid because someone refuses to acknowledge it. One of the most difficult lessons after a painful relationship is realizing that closure is not always an apology. Sometimes closure is accepting that someone may never become the person you hoped they would become. You may never see the moment when they finally understand your tears. You may never hear the words you deserve to hear. You may never receive the accountability that would make everything feel balanced. But your freedom begins when you stop waiting for someone else to confirm what you already know. The person who hurt you may have their own unresolved wounds, fears, and emotional limitations. But those limitations do not have to become your prison. Their inability to love in a healthy way does not mean you were unworthy of love. Sometimes the most powerful answer is not discovering whether they feel bad after hurting you. The most powerful answer is discovering that you no longer need their regret to prove your worth. Because healing is not about watching someone else finally understand your pain. Healing is about reaching a place where their lack of understanding no longer controls your peace. It is a question that comes from a very human place. When someone hurts us deeply, especially someone we trusted, loved, or built a future around, our mind naturally searches for meaning. We want to know if our pain was seen. We want to know if our tears mattered. We want to know if the person who caused the damage ever sat alone and realized the impact of their actions. And the answer is not as simple as many people hope. It is not that narcissistic individuals feel nothing. Human emotions are far more complicated than that. People with strong narcissistic traits can experience emotions, but the way they process those emotions may look very different from someone with a more secure sense of empathy, accountability, and emotional awareness. A person with narcissistic patterns may feel discomfort, anger, shame, regret, loneliness, or a sense of loss after hurting someone. But the difficult part is that these feelings are often centered around their own experience rather than the pain they caused another person. There is a difference between feeling bad because someone is suffering and feeling bad because their own image, comfort, or control has been threatened. For example, a narcissistic person may not think, "I hurt someone I loved and I need to understand their pain." Instead, their internal reaction may sound more like, "Why is this happening to me? Why are they leaving? Why am I being blamed?" The emotional focus can turn inward, making the situation about their own wounded pride, rejection, or loss of control. This is one of the most confusing parts of being hurt by someone with narcissistic traits. The person who caused the pain may appear unaffected. They may move on quickly, act confident, post happy moments, start new relationships, or behave as if nothing happened. To the person who is hurt, this can feel like proof that the relationship meant nothing. But appearances can be misleading. Someone avoiding accountability is not the same as someone feeling nothing. Some people protect themselves from painful emotions by denying them, minimizing them, or shifting blame. Instead of facing the uncomfortable truth that they harmed someone, they create a different story where they are the victim, the misunderstood person, or the one who was wronged. This psychological defense protects their self-image. Accepting full responsibility would require them to confront a painful reality. I hurt someone who cared about me. For a person with strong narcissistic defenses, that realization may feel threatening because it challenges the version of themselves they want to maintain. This is why apologies from narcissistic individuals can sometimes feel confusing. An apology may come not because they fully understand the emotional damage they caused, but because they miss access to the relationship, attention, validation, or comfort that person provided. They may regret losing the connection without truly understanding the wounds they created. However, this does not mean every person with narcissistic traits is incapable of change or reflection. Human beings exist on a spectrum. Some individuals can develop greater self-awareness, especially when they are willing to examine their behavior, accept responsibility, and seek meaningful personal growth. But change requires something many people struggle with: the ability to look honestly at themselves without immediately defending their ego. The most painful trap for survivors of narcissistic relationships is waiting for a moment of realization. They imagine a day when the other person finally understands everything they did, feels the same pain they caused, and comes back with a perfect apology. That fantasy is understandable because the mind wants justice. It wants the story to make sense. But healing often begins when you stop measuring your recovery by whether someone else finally understands your pain. The closure you need may not come from their regret. It may come from your own understanding of what happened. You begin to realize that someone's inability to acknowledge your value does not determine your value. Someone's lack of accountability does not erase the reality of what you experienced. A narcissistic person may feel the absence of someone who loved them. They may miss the attention, loyalty, care, or emotional support they received. They may even experience moments of regret. But the deeper question is not only, do they feel something? The deeper question is, are they capable of turning that feeling into genuine responsibility and change? Because emotions without accountability do not create healing. Regret without transformation does not repair damage. Words without consistent action do not rebuild trust. The most powerful shift happens when you stop waiting for someone else to validate your suffering and start validating yourself. You begin to understand that your pain was real, your experience mattered, and your healing does not need permission from the person who hurt you. Sometimes the greatest freedom comes from accepting that you may never receive the explanation, apology, or emotional response you hoped for. Not because your story was insignificant, but because your peace cannot depend on someone else finally seeing what they refused to see. The person who hurt you may carry their own unresolved wounds, insecurities, and emotional limitations, but your journey is about becoming free from the impact of those limitations. The goal is not to make them feel what you felt. The goal is to return to yourself, rebuild your confidence, and create a life where your worth is no longer determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. They feel plenty, actually, but almost none of it looks like what you've been hoping for. And once you understand the gap between what they're really experiencing and what you've spent so long waiting for them to experience, something inside you finally starts to loosen. Something finally starts to heal. If you're someone working through recognizing manipulation, untangling old emotional wounds, and rebuilding the confidence that was slowly worn down over time, consider subscribing, because that's exactly what this channel is here for, helping you see clearly, heal fully, and build a version of yourself that no one can shrink again. Let's start where most survivors start, with the obsessing. If you've spent hours, weeks, even years wondering whether the person who hurt you ever felt guilt, shame, regret, sadness, fear, or even a flicker of remorse, you're not strange and you're not weak. You're someone whose nervous system is still searching for an ending that actually makes sense. Our minds are wired to crave coherence. When someone we trusted hurts us deeply, the brain instinctively tries to complete the story. We want proof that the pain meant something. We want confirmation that they understood what they did. We want to believe that somewhere in some private moment, they sat with the weight of it. Because if they did, then our suffering was witnessed. And if it was witnessed, maybe it wasn't for nothing. That's not weakness. That's your mind trying to repair a break that the other person refused to repair with you. But here's the first uncomfortable truth that starts to set you free. The emotional world of someone with strong narcissistic traits isn't empty. It's just organized completely differently. Where you'd feel guilt, they tend to feel exposed. Where you'd feel remorse, they tend to feel humiliated. Where you'd feel sadness over hurting someone, they tend to feel irritated that the situation has slipped out of their control. This isn't a moral judgment. It's a psychological pattern that's been documented for decades in the clinical literature on narcissistic personality structures. Their inner world isn't hollow. It's heavily guarded. And those defenses run so deep, so automatically, so rooted in early experiences of shame and inadequacy that real accountability almost never makes it past the gate. When you picture them feeling regret, what you're really doing is projecting your own emotional world onto theirs. You're imagining what you would feel if you had treated someone the way they treated you. And because you're an empathic person, that imagined feeling would be unbearable. You wouldn't sleep, you'd reach out, you'd apologize, you'd try to fix it, you'd carry that weight for years. So naturally, understandably, you assume they must be carrying something similar. But they're not carrying your kind of weight. They're carrying their own, and theirs is shaped by something entirely different. The need to protect a self-image that can't tolerate being seen as flawed, cruel, or wrong. This is where the difference between genuine remorse and narcissistic injury becomes so important. Genuine remorse is focused outward. It's the painful awareness of having caused someone else harm, and it creates a drive to repair, to make amends, to actually understand the impact of what you did. Narcissistic injury is focused entirely inward. It's the painful awareness of having been exposed, criticized, or seen as less than perfect, and it creates a drive to defend, deflect, retaliate, or rewrite the story. From the outside, both can look like an emotional reaction to wrongdoing, but internally, they're worlds apart. One leads to growth, the other leads to damage control. So when someone with narcissistic traits seems upset after hurting you, pause and really ask yourself what that upset is actually about. Are they upset because they genuinely grasp your pain? Or are they upset because they've lost access to you, lost control of the story, lost their supply of admiration, or lost the version of themselves they'd been performing in front of you? Those are two completely different things. And learning to tell them apart is one of the most valuable skills you'll ever build. Not just for this relationship, but for everyone that comes after it. Then there's self-pity, which a lot of survivors mistake for remorse. Self-pity can sound like regret on the surface. It uses similar language. It can even come with real tears. But self-pity isn't about you. It's about them. It's the grief of someone who feels like a victim of the consequences of their own choices. They might say they feel awful, but listen closely and you'll notice the awful feeling is about what they've lost, not what you went through. It's about how they're perceived, not how they treated you. It's about their own loneliness, not your wounds. Self-pity is one of the most convincing counterfeits of remorse there is, and it's one of the main things that pulls survivors back into cycles they thought they'd finally escaped. And then there's wounded pride, which might be the most common emotional aftermath for narcissistic individuals following any real conflict. To them, wounded pride feels like an injury you inflicted on them. In their internal story, they're not the one who caused harm, they're the one who was misunderstood, mistreated, abandoned, or unfairly judged. This isn't always conscious manipulation. For a lot of people, it's an automatic reshaping of reality meant to protect something fragile at the core. Their pride gets wounded because the image they worked so hard to build has cracked, and someone, namely you, has seen behind the curtain. What usually follows isn't an apology. It's more often anger, contempt, withdrawal, or a smear campaign designed to rewrite the story so they stay the hero and you become the villain. And then there's fear. Yes, narcissists absolutely feel fear, and understanding it is key if you want to really grasp what's going on beneath the surface. They fear being exposed. They fear being seen as ordinary. They fear losing control over how other people perceive them. They fear losing their supply, meaning the attention, admiration, validation, or emotional reaction they get from the people around them. And somewhere deep down, in a place they rarely acknowledge, they fear that if the mask ever completely slipped, there might be nothing underneath it. That fear isn't the same thing as caring about you, but it can masquerade as caring, especially when it's what drives them to come back, to offer a vague apology, to love bomb you, to promise they'll change. What you're witnessing in those moments usually isn't love returning. It's fear returning, the fear of losing the mirror they preferred to see themselves in. That's exactly why their apologies, when they do come, so often feel hollow. You've probably noticed that even in their most seemingly remorseful moments, something crucial was missing. There was no real acknowledgement of what they actually did. No curiosity about how you felt. No question about what you might need in order to heal. Instead, there were sweeping statements, vague regrets, quick pivots back to their own pain, or subtle hints that you played a part in it too. That's not because you were asking too much. It's because true accountability requires a level of self-confrontation their psychological structure is built specifically to avoid. To genuinely apologize, they'd have to see themselves clearly, and seeing themselves clearly is exactly what their defenses exist to prevent. It's also worth remembering that not everyone with narcissistic traits experiences these emotions in the same way or to the same degree. Narcissism exists on a spectrum, and people are complicated. Some individuals do have moments of real insight, especially in the right therapeutic setting, though those moments tend to be rarer and more fragile than survivors often hope for. Others stay locked in patterns of denial and projection for their entire lives. The goal here isn't to diagnose the person who hurt you or predict what they'll do next. The goal is to free yourself from the exhausting job of waiting for an internal transformation you can't cause and can't control. And this is exactly where the focus needs to shift. Because if you spend the rest of your life trying to decode their inner world, you'll lose your own in the process. The more energy you pour into understanding them, the less you have left to understand yourself. And the truth survivors eventually land on, often after years of searching, is that the most important person to understand in this whole story was never them. It's you. If any of this is landing for you, if something inside you is finally exhaling after carrying these questions alone for so long, take a second to subscribe. Every video on this channel is built around this same goal: clarity, real psychological insight, emotional grounding, and healthier ways to move through the aftermath of relationships that asked far too much of you and gave far too little back. Now let's go a layer deeper, because there's something underneath all of this that almost nobody talks about. The reason you fixate on whether they feel anything isn't really about them at all. It's about you. Specifically, it's about a younger version of you who learned somewhere along the way that your pain only counted if someone else acknowledged it. Maybe it was a parent who brushed off your tears. Maybe it was a family that valued appearances over honesty. Maybe it was a culture that taught you to stay quiet, agreeable, and forgiving even while you were being hurt. However it happened, you learned that your suffering needed outside validation to be real. So, when someone hurts you and refuses to acknowledge it, an old wound reopens, and your longing for their recognition gets tangled up with much older longings for recognition you never got in the first place. That's why the obsession feels so all-consuming. It was never just about this one relationship. It's about every moment in your life when your pain was minimized, dismissed, or rewritten by someone who couldn't or wouldn't truly see you. And the most radical, most healing thing you can do is this: start validating your own pain without waiting for them to do it for you. Become the witness you've always been waiting for. Sit with your younger self and say, what happened to you was real. What you felt was real. You don't need their confession to make that true. And once you start doing this, something remarkable happens. The trauma bond begins to loosen. Trauma bonds aren't held together by love. They're held together by unresolved emotional cycles, by intermittent reinforcement, by your nervous system's constant attempt to predict and manage an unpredictable person. The bond survives because part of you is still waiting for the moment they'll finally understand, finally apologize, finally become the person they only ever pretended to be. And as long as you're still waiting, you're still tethered. The bond doesn't break when they change. It breaks when you stop waiting. This is also when real boundaries become possible. Not walls built out of anger, but quiet acts of self-respect built out of clarity. A boundary isn't a punishment. It's a recognition of reality. When you set a boundary with someone who has shown you, again and again, exactly who they are, you're not being cruel. You're simply done pretending. You're no longer organizing your life around the hope that they'll become someone they've never actually chosen to become. You're accepting things as they are. And from that acceptance, you get to choose what you'll let into your life going forward. And in that process of acceptance, you start reclaiming something you might not even have realized you'd lost, your own perception. One of the most damaging effects of being with a narcissistic person is how it erodes trust in your own sense of reality. You were told you were too sensitive, too emotional, too much, too little, too suspicious, too forgetful. Over time, you started doubting what you saw, what you felt, what you actually knew. Healing means slowly, patiently rebuilding the bridge back to your own perception. It means trusting that what you felt was accurate. It means learning to believe yourself again. This is one of the quietest, most powerful parts of recovery, and it can't happen while you're still measuring your own reality against theirs. You'll also start to release the fantasy of closure. Closure, in the way most people picture it, is a conversation where the other person finally understands, finally apologizes, finally hands you the missing piece that lets you move on. But that kind of closure almost never comes from someone with deeply rooted narcissistic patterns. And the longer you wait for it, the longer you stay emotionally suspended in a relationship that's already over. Real closure isn't something they hand to you. Real closure is something you build inside yourself. Slowly, through understanding, through grief, through reclaiming your own time, attention, and energy. Real closure is the moment you realize you no longer need the conversation you once thought you couldn't live without. There will be moments, of course, when you slip backward, moments when an old memory surfaces and you catch yourself wondering again whether they ever think about you, whether any part of what they put you through ever actually reaches them. Those moments aren't failures. They're just your nervous system processing what happened in waves, the same way the body processes any significant loss. Be gentle with yourself in those moments. Remind yourself that wondering isn't the same thing as going back. Remind yourself that you can hold the question without letting it drag you back into the orbit of someone who couldn't love you the way you deserved. And as the months go by, you'll start to notice something subtle but profound. You'll think about them less. Your own sense of self will start filling in the space they used to take up. Your laughter will come back. Your interests will come back. Your curiosity about your own life will come back. Your nervous system will start to settle. You'll notice you're no longer scanning every conversation for danger, no longer bracing for the next emotional whiplash. That's what healing actually looks like. Not one dramatic turning point, but a slow, steady return to yourself. If this message is reaching you at the right time, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who might be quietly carrying this same weight right now. Because the people who need to hear this often don't know how to ask for it. And your small act of sharing might be the first bit of clarity that finds its way into their life. So here's what you can carry forward from this. The person who hurt you may feel plenty of things, but most of what they feel will never be what you were hoping for. Their silence isn't a verdict on your worth. Their refusal to acknowledge what they did isn't proof that it didn't happen. Their inability to truly see you says nothing about how visible you really are. You are not invisible. You are not too much. You are not the problem they tried to convince you that you were. You are someone who loved deeply, who tried sincerely, who endured with patience, and who is now, finally, choosing yourself. And the moment you stop waiting for an admission that may never come is the moment your healing truly begins. Because freedom was never theirs to hand you. Freedom was always yours to claim, quietly and completely on your own.